Well, I think what we're going to do now is we're going to have each of our speakers come up and join us at the dais, and we'll entertain some questions. I have, just by way of sort of connecting the current session with last year's, I mentioned that much of the discussion last year focused on sort of the relative benefits of traditional preserves versus active, traditional historically based restoration versus facilitating call them novel ecosystems for the purposes of sustaining some biodiversity of our choosing across the landscape. I think each of our speakers kind of touched on various aspects of that, but I'm curious to know, thinking about the landscapes that each of you worked in or have worked on and are familiar with, and what contributed to conservation in each of those cases. What in those cases, what was the relative contribution of each of those strategies? And thinking a little bit further, what would be the ideal if you could design integrated landscape strategy? What would be the ideal set of strategies or allocation of strategies to your landscapes? Go ahead, Scott.
Does this work? Can you hear me? You know, I think of it very much as landscape specific. I don't think there's ever a perfect set. We work a lot with ranches and farms, and ranches and farms are both agriculture, but what we do with them is totally different. On farms, we're planting totally novel ecosystems. We're taking crops out that have sometimes been in for 80 years, on landscapes that have not seen a native plant, and we're putting a system of native plants back in that would have never lived in that arrangement. But there's no other way to do it on farms. These are often linear, long hedgerows or meadows, but they never exactly existed. And I'll give you an example. We're doing big projects in the Central Valley, 7-mile long hedgerows. They're all native plants, they're all drought adapted. They all grow somewhere in the Central Valley. They would have never grown in a 40-foot wide strip 7 miles long. But they are serving wildlife in a big way. There's great data to show that beyond pollinators and other beneficial insects, as they age, birds, rodents, all sorts of animals are using them. And totally different than Martin, where I've worked, where we want to, I think, get back to what should have been there with a thoughtful approach to climate change. So it's hard to have some toolbox with that exact set for every situation.
Sure.
Well, in Florida, I think, you know, we've made too radical of a shift from the old school type of natural res conservation, you know, kind of the George Fell to Bob Jenkins phase of Nature Conservancy conservation, for example, over to this working landscapes conservation paradigm. And, you know, they're both worthwhile, and they serve different purposes. And as we can see from the Florida example, we have these endemic packed, you know, relatively, usually small natural areas that are now kind of being abandoned, and we've shifted over to this large landscape conservation, which, you know, I helped introduce the state of Florida. And again, I'm feeling a bit guilty about it. I think we need to get back to a healthy mix between the two approaches.
I don't think I have a lot to add to that, but in the Laramie Foothills, we have that diversity of management in place, and probably because of the scale, the size of the parcels, the stewardship that's happened on those places, we have really good to excellent condition on most of those lands. And so we've really endeavored to try to limit in terms of like very traditional preserves, recognizing that there are people's livelihoods at stake, but also recognizing that they have good management tools and restoration can play a significant role there. So I think in our situation, you'll see all of those things in our landscape, but it's about the condition that exists and the existing stewardship and management, and working from there to kind of figure out what that combination is.
Good. I just had one other little question. It occurred to me in listening to all of your talks. Scott, you mentioned the importance of having a kind of a complex of sites to essentially spread the risk of potential loss to any given site. And Heather, you mentioned the importance of risk and taking risks in your landscape. I'm wondering whether, and Reed, even in, I think, kind of you were aiming at sort of a strategy of redundancy and the need to address potential loss. In each of your cases, was risk an explicit, was risk spreading explicitly incorporated into the strategy? And if not, do you have any recommendations for how individuals in the audience can participate in kind of a risk spreading strategy?
I mean, I work on a lot of rare endemic, some of them endangered, formally endangered, but all of them really at-risk species. And I think we think about risk in every one of those. When you're down to 3 or 4 populations, you're really narrowing that risk pool. And as we found populations of marten skipper, we didn't want to just focus on the largest or the best. We really wanted to focus across the landscape and reconnect them wherever possible. Where we've worked on stoneflies in stream systems, where a stonefly might be above an outflow, you have populations above and below. You want to think of both of those populations, because what happens if impoundment is put on that lower outflow and the populations below it are impacted. So in my view, I think of risk in all of our endangered species work. In our general habitat work, often that's just opportunistic, and I think the more the better. Yeah. So I guess that's in some ways a form. I'm thinking of risk just not as inherent, it's just inherent. Because my goal is to have as many of these natural areas as valuable as possible for biodiversity, whether they're large, whether they're incredible, like the Laramie Canyon, which I spent some time out there documenting the insects for Boris, or they're small, and the woodlot where I grew up. I mean, they're all really important, and we need to maximize the potential of all of them.
I think about risk the same way as Scott, but also a little differently too. I think about when threats are high and your biodiversity is high and the impact on people is also high, you have to kind of judge, what's the trade-off between action or limiting that action. And I think being very strategic about that, thinking carefully through it, and when you're asking people to perhaps try management strategies that are different, maybe a little untested, could have impacts on their livelihoods that are real and economic, that's when risk becomes more personal. And also you have to start to think about contingency planning. And I think we haven't done that as well as we probably should. And taking an experimental approach to management actions and conservation is really important in that moment, and being very clear about it, that these are the risks, this is the approach we're going to take. Our expectation is certain things will happen, and if they don't, what are we going to do, and how are we going to, do we wait to the end and then say, oops, or do we actually have a process that you go through that you're looking for indicators about whether you're heading in the right direction or not, so that you can adapt your management and your actions and shift slightly to try to meet those outcomes. So taking calculated risk is what I prefer to talk about with all of those factors in mind.
In Florida, to my knowledge, risk has really not been considered explicitly by conservation planners, either in the state or the private sector. It's more a question of, if we don't protect these areas quickly, we have a risk of losing them completely to new development. So that's been the main concern. But I think, again, implicitly, there's been an acknowledgement of the need for redundancy, that you need, if you have these rare species, you don't protect them just one place. You need to have multiple sites, so that kind of spreads the risk of loss of any particular population. So it's been an implicit thing rather than a calculated thing, I think.
Great. Just one last thing before we turn to the audience for questions. You three have obviously been great leaders in conservation, and particularly in conservation at this larger scale. But a lot of the people in the audience aren't really in a position, or maybe haven't felt like they've been in a position to lead such efforts. Do you have any recommendations for individual preserve managers in terms of how they can contribute to large-scale conservation in general?
I guess we're going this way. Continue that trend. Yes, I mean, I think you do need to focus on your preserve and make it as biodiverse relevant as possible. You need to make this a place with whatever your goals are in mind, whether you're including recreation and other things. But there are often things you can do to improve these landscapes, and you know that better than me. But I think where Xerces has really come in, and where I think individual managers are a part of it and can be even more of a part of it, is to look outside your preserve and figure out who else is working within that landscape. Is it, could it be Colorado DOT, where they're right now looking at lands to change their mowing regime to increase biodiversity on roadways? Could it be a power line right-of-way that is adjacent? Could it be a school? Could it be a river corridor that's close enough that you can connect these landscapes up? So look at who else is in your sphere, and don't just limit it to maybe other parks people, although they're important, or other natural areas people, but maybe think outside the box and how you can make your natural area a hub for maybe even some smaller areas around it. And then you're the big guy in the pool, bringing in those smaller habitats.
Great.
I guess I would add to that two things. I would say find a mentor. Find somebody who's working in this area, who's done this, who's willing to share their knowledge and expertise, and then provide you with support and feedback. For me, that was critical. And then I would say, echoing what Scott said, is one of the first things we did is we took people from our community somewhere else to see people doing this in another place. They were with their peers in a different landscape who were facing even bigger challenges. And the point was, other people are already doing this, and you can do it too. It might be slightly different, but if those people with really much more tough situations can do it, surely we can do it as well. And I think that made us stop for a moment and really take carefully into our minds, what the opportunity was and what our responsibility was.
I think one key point is any one of us can make a substantial, critical contribution to conservation. Don't wait for our political leaders, for our agency heads, for our organizational heads to come up with the ideas. It's often lower level staff that come up with ideas. I mean, you take out a Leopold as an example. Leopold came up with some of his fundamental insights while he was, working on horseback as a forester on southwestern national forests. And, in many other cases, it were students and lower level agency employees that came up with a lot of these plans that are now, considered, kind of the status quo for how we do conservation. So it's up to everybody to be thinking about these things. And if an idea comes to you that seems like a good one, there's a pretty good chance it is a good idea. So go ahead and pursue it. and get some support for it and go with it.
Great responses. Who's got the microphone out there? All right, Paula. Do we have any questions back here, out here in the audience? Yeah. Why don't we get you a microphone before you, so we can get you recorded.
This is for Reed. Is this on?
Yep.
Okay. I just was really agreeing with your comments about the sites for narrow endemics missing the boat a lot of time with big conservation efforts. And I have felt in recent years, and I don't know if you've gotten this too, that TNC has sort of abandoned endangered species and the small sites. And I've seen it happen in a few places. And there are so many of them, and it's too much to expect TNC to be able to do all of that. Somebody told me 20 years ago, Cecil, we can't save all the species. And that's sort of an obvious thing. Have you given any thought to, what's really happening with all of those sites? There's, thousands of them, and what might be possible in the future? Like, what approaches could we take?
Thanks, Cecil. That's really a topic I think about every day, virtually. As I mentioned in my talk, I've been a Nature Conservancy member for decades, and a lot of the early work that I did was in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy, and same with Larry Harris, and I mentioned both the Ohio Edge of Appalachia system and the Pinnock Swamp. All those were TNC projects. Today, I think you're absolutely right. TNC has shifted away from protecting sites for rare species, with some important exceptions, and towards more of a working landscape model, which again, one of my main points is that these should not be mutually exclusive. They're both important. But who is going to protect those small sites with rare species? And personally, I'm not willing to give up on any species. I'm not willing to lose anything. I know that we will, but if we consign ourselves to failure there, then we'll surely fail. I agree with the Zero Extinction Alliance, or whatever they're being called now, that we should try to prevent all human-caused extinctions. Now, we know we won't succeed completely, but if we just say, we'll just let half species go, no big deal, that's a real cop-out. So we need to get back to identifying these sites, and especially, the old approach of hotspots is very valuable. Sites that are packed with rare species, especially endemic, but are also at risk of destruction. I mean, this kind of irreplaceability versus vulnerability framework has been used by many names, by many organizations, from TNC to Conservation International to World Wildlife Fund, and yet I don't see it being used as much today. The whole hotspots thing has kind of fallen out of favor, even within Conservation International, which was the main group that really promoted that idea. But hotspots occur at all scales. They're not just global biodiversity hotspots. Every landscape has its hotspots. So recognizing those and protecting them while working with landowners to manage land properly across large landscapes are things that are totally compatible and need to be pursued in tandem.
I already have the microphone. Is this
Oh,
thing really
there you
working? Cool. Hey, awesome presentations. There were a couple of common themes that went through them all, and one of them was the amazing difficulties that you have had to surmount to work at large landscape scales. And it was very cool to kind of see, from the small scale to the really big scale. So what I'm interested in is, like, for example, I think, Reed, maybe you made this the most clear, but it was common to all of you guys, was, in Florida, I mean, really, I didn't know 30% of the state was under some level of relatively high protection. That's mind-blowing, okay? So for a lot of people in this audience, you put it real well. It's like, oh, wow, we're done there. Let's go elsewhere. So, and then, the other case studies, too, made really clear that, that another issue is sort of political will and local support and what people know. So what I want to know is, given that you just gave great examples of amazing success stories, where do you go from here? What's the next gear, and how do you get there? And are you guys comfortable with the idea, and some of this was implicit in some of what you said, are you comfortable with the idea of kind of getting into the ecosystem service business, stuff like that? I'd just like your take on how do you get from beyond the things that you've done thus far and that you see as successes to where, because you know and we know that it's not enough. So in this political age, in this economic age, how do we get there? What are the linkages? How do you get to society? How do you change people's minds about expanding reserve networks that are already big enough?
Well, I think to reach more broadly, we need to, as scientists, become better communicators. So that's number one. Alan Alda has a great new book out. Alan Alda started doing documentaries with scientists, and evidently early on found that these scientists couldn't communicate enough to even be in his documentaries. So he started doing a series of workshops for scientists to help them communicate. And we do need to communicate better, whether it's ecosystem service, which I think is an important one that we should talk about. But it shouldn't be the only thing we talk about. And I think that some conservation organizations, and we do work with Conservation International, but they went really from this biodiversity hotspot to this ecosystem service idea. And I think there's some credibility there, and ecosystem services are really important, and some people grasp them. But we need to look at where are the leverage points for people. What do they care about, and how do we bring them along? I work on invertebrates, and so, our charismatic animals are monarchs, but pollinators. But we're starting a project in urban areas with park managers and others where we're talking monarchs and pollinators to bring in overall biodiversity. We're kind of getting in the door with what people think we're coming in to talk about, and we're going to talk about water quality and pesticides and green lawns and the whole bit, and birds. We're not above talking about those vertebrates. To bring us along. But I think we need leverage points. I think we need communication, and we need to figure out how to communicate to new audiences, especially young people. And there are folks out there that can help us do that, but we need to do that better.
I now am at Colorado State University at the Center for Collaborative Conservation and retired from the Nature Conservancy May last year. And I see the opportunity at the center all about building collaborative capacity. I think the place in the future where this work is going to happen comes from the community and landscape scale upwards. I think we have to build the capacity of those organizations and partnerships and collaboratives so that they're sustainable. So irrespective of changes in federal administration and budgeting and the trickle-down effect, that those organizations working together in the places that they know and love have the capacity to do that, and to do that long-term and to be effective at it. And part of that is building, we've trained all of us very well. We're highly competent technically, but very few of us are natural-born leaders and facilitators and, as Scott says, communicators and negotiators. It's these other skills that we just expect people to just go out there into these human landscapes and be able to communicate and engage people and solve these issues in an effective way, and you're done. So I think we need to, and we have started this, to really train our natural resources and conservation practitioners and partners to a higher level in these collaboration skills so that they can be more effective in their conservation outcomes.
Well, to me, I guess it's all about biophilia and natural history. By that I mean, I agree with Ed Wilson, E.O. Wilson, that children are born with an inherent attraction and affiliation with living things, with nature. And they progressively lose that through their parents, through their teachers, through a society in general who tells them that that's not important. My son, when he was, I think it was about 3rd grade, the kids were going around, the teacher asked them what they wanted to be when they grew up. My son said herpetologist, and she laughed and said, "Oh, you'll grow out of that." So we're taught from the time we're young that that's not important. So gradually our biophilia doesn't completely disintegrate, but it's lost. But the key to preventing that from being lost, I think, is solid natural history education, which is, it's starting to be an upswing now, again, finally, in this country at least. Nature study used to be a required part of the curriculum for public schools in the early and mid 20th century in the United States. Then it just totally disappeared. Environmental education was big in the 60s and 70s, but then it became more and more divorced from natural history. That was my original field, and I left it because there was very little natural history education left in it. But I'm seeing that, through my own kids and kids that I've, have experience in knowing and leading on nature walks and stuff, that you can keep people interested. And even some adults can be brought back into the fold of biophilia with the exposure to nature and just how wonderful it is. Now, I will use myself ecosystem service arguments at times. I mean, they're real. They really do exist. I mean, intact forests really do protect watersheds and so on, but it's a slippery slope because, I am quite sure that you could lose, in many cases, half of your native species in a given biological community, and that community would provide ecosystem services just as well as it did before. We could have those natives replaced by exotics. We could have massive waves of extinctions, and we could still get ecosystem services, and I'm not willing to live in that kind of world. So I emphasize the intrinsic value of each and every living thing. And I think that with natural history, you come to respect species as valuable for their own sake and in their own right. But it takes work. It takes educators, it takes good communicators at all levels.
Excellent. Dave.
Thank you very much. The three of you are true conservation geniuses. I really hope I can grow up to be more like you somehow. Hence my question. I sort of listening to your inspirational talks and sort of coming to think of the fence that you took down, Heather, as sort of a metaphor for, taking down that fence wasn't, it was keeping the cows out, but it was keeping your ideas in, and you almost like released this Pandora's box of catalyzing change across this huge landscape when you did that, is how it felt from your presentation. And I think you touched on that, Scott, too, about that sort of transformation of how people are thinking. And so first you have to have really good ideas, which all three of you have. I don't know how that, that's your own unique genius, but all three of you have been so effective in taking those ideas out to a group of stakeholders that weren't even thinking about those. And so I'm kind of curious if there are some lessons you can impart to us and how you were so effective in getting those things to happen under these improbable circumstances that you've been successful.
That's, I think, the hardest question we've had so far. They're getting harder as we go along here. Yeah, so, I think the thing, again, is that ideas really do spring from being well-rounded and really thinking about not just my side of this, and I am in a brotherhood with Reed over many of these issues, but we have to think about how these other people are thinking. They don't think like me. I can go to you and say, yeah, let's do this, and you're like, sweet, let's do this. But I need to think about, how do I talk to that farmer who has a bottom line to keep, who has done this certain way for this many years, and it's by two things. It's getting out there and really thinking about what's important to them, but also getting out there and having the conversations back and forth and thinking about really going out. And in the farm landscape, the best conversations happen around a tractor. They really do. And if you get into farm work, if you get into farm conservation, make sure you know your tractors. Make sure you know which ones are cool. And make sure that you can even help fix them from time to time. But but never you lose your sense. And I think that sometimes we do go a little far. I don't ever say anything that I don't truly believe. And sometimes I'll disagree when I'm out there talking to a large farmer, but I'll disagree respectfully, and we can have that conversation and see where we can meet. So I have no idea whether I really answered your question, but I do think that you need to be thinking about how do we get them to move our way a bit, and how do you impart why this is so important to them in some way. And I think many people do come back, and many people love nature. And just a very quick story, we worked with this farmer who at first was a little skeptical, and UC Davis went out in the 1960s and 70s and had a head of the ag department that told people they needed to take out every natural area around their farm, every one. They harbored diseases and pests. And so this guy's father had taken out acres and acres of natural areas. But once we started talking about it and he started to grasp that this could be important to re-impart, he actually took a step back and said, actually, I remember how sad my dad was when he took this out. He said, this is where the hawks live. This is where the eagle comes. But that guy at UC Davis, he's the scientist. I've got to do what he said. So, but that happened after a couple conversations where originally he wasn't going to do it, and in the end, he had some money. He's got 40,000 acres in the Central Valley, but he's put in about 4 miles of 50-foot to 80-foot long or wide hedgerows of willow and other flowering plants. That was a conversation between us. But I had to get to understand him and spend the time. And I think that's where if sometimes we need to do things fast, and sometimes it's so hard because stuff comes crashing down, but where I think you said it well, where we can work together, we're going to have this for a longer period of time. So I have no idea whether I answered your question.
Yeah, David, it's a hard question. Thank you for asking it. There's a lot to say about this, but I would say Rick and I were given really good advice when we first moved to that watershed. And we were told to shut up and listen, essentially, for 5 years or so. And what that person meant by that was, we all bring with us our own experiences, our own values, all kinds of things. And we often forget that when we arrive in a place, that comes with us. And similarly, all those people in that place have that too. And so we have to remind ourselves that people are there because they love that place, right? They're connected to it. They find some meaning in it. But we've become much more urbanized, and we've lost some of those connections. So I think it's about being willing to be open to hear about each one of those people in that place and inviting them to know you, and then finding what it is that you have in common. And there's going to be, sometimes the gap is wide, but sometimes, surprisingly, it's actually not that far apart. And it's about really focusing on, we may have slightly different motivations, and we might rank those things a little differently, but those ranchers in that community were there because for generations they loved that place, and that's where they raised their children. People moving from town were going there because they were seeking a better place also to be, and going back to nature and willing to drive and take their kids to town multiple times a week to play soccer and all those other things. And they loved that place, but they were somewhat disconnected. So it's about spending the time to really understand that and to listen and to see their stories, hear what they've done in the past, and try to fathom a way forward together where you can start in a common place, and as you build trust, then you can start to talk about the more difficult things. but I would say learning to listen, drinking a lot of coffee, learning to ride a horse in our case, learning to fix fence, learning to get dirty, and to do more, I think is important.
Well, as Scott and Heather emphasized more than I did, the importance of being able to communicate with an audience is key. And that means you have to know your audience and what's important to them. And that brings me back again to Outer Leopold. Because a big part of Leopold's Genius was being able to give the same general message to a diverse set of audiences, be they farmers, ranchers, hunters, scientists, politicians, fellow members of the Wilderness Society, give the same underlying message, but in very different terms, very different specific arguments that he knew would be important to that particular audience. And he was a genius at doing that. I have personally never read anybody else who could do it so well. And if you read Outer Leopold's biography by Rick and my good friend Kurt Miney, published in 1988, Outer Leopold, His Life and Work, there's samples from his various speeches that he gave to these groups, and you'll see this remarkable ability to speak to those people on their own terms, but give the same message that how important conserving the land is for all of us.
Great. Do we have a distributed
So-
microphone at this point? Oh, there we go.
Thank
That's
you.
good. There you
I just had a comment in response to a couple of folks that mentioned that the Nature Conservancy is moving away from the large landscape protection. And I agree, and that's been a concern of mine too, just that shift. But I think we need to think about the wise words of our panel here to really listen and where are they coming from. And I think it's great that they're really looking at these large landscapes. And here in Colorado, and I suspect it's also true in other places around the country, we have a lot of other land trusts that are partnering with us to protect the smaller sites. And there are coalitions of land trusts. There's the county government, the municipalities, even our Colorado Department of Transportation has been working with us on this sort of small site conservation. So I think it's really important to have, and I think that was certainly the comment that, and Reed's emphasis to, we really have to be doing both, to be thinking of, and the Nature Conservancy is well poised to be thinking about the larger landscapes, and these other land trusts and other partners are can help with some of the smaller sites. So.
Great. We have 10 minutes left or so we can take a couple more here. But,
we're dominating in this sector here. I did have a question. It kind of touched on the ecosystem services thing. So I worked for 4 years for a nonprofit in California. We were focused on doing restoration on private lands, so farmers and ranches. Mostly farms, though, where they didn't want to deal with agencies, and so we kind of came in, and a lot of this had to do in the San Joaquin River Basin, which has just been devastated. And we were looking at actually small tributaries to try to do restoration on the tributaries to get habitat back, but also to cool down the stream temperatures and get some groundwater back. And originally the landowners everyone complained, oh, it's all that red tape, and we need 12 different permits if we want to reshape the stream bank. And so it came out originally as an argument, oh, it's just too much bureaucracy, they don't want to do it. So I worked on this integrated permitting framework that actually dovetailed the federal, state, and local permitting that was, you could hand to a landowner on a silver platter, and we did, and it was crickets. And then what I really realized after spending years on this, and people before me had spent years on it, is we were missing this incentive piece. So I started looking around in the toolbox, and I found this ecosystem services thing, and that still seemed like eons away from ever getting out of theoretical land to like really something that could turn revenue. So I guess my question to the panel is, and these are areas that you could actually get farm bill money out there to do buffers and so forth, but the NRCS and the resource conservation districts, those streams that we wanted to focus on were not necessarily in their priority areas, so they weren't freeing money up for that. So in a case like that, what could be a incentive to really get a landowner excited, because as you've observed, they're dealing with profit margin issues and they're trying to raise crops, and this restoration stuff seems like a boutique thing to them.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and the NRCS is great. We did, and so in full disclosure, we have 12 partner biologists with NRCS. So just in full disclosure, and this ecosystem service argument is great, but I do again think it only goes so far. And I'm going to use pollinators as an example of that. So there are a lot of crops in California. We work, sustainable conservation, is that who you worked for? Yeah, I knew that. Good organization who we've partnered with in the past. So we do a lot of work in the Central Valley, and we work with farmers on mostly the issue of pollinators. And the ecosystem service are, that's one that's really concrete. You've got a crop, it flowers, it needs a bee to pollinate it, and there's really good data that if you put habitat out there, you can bring in native bees and either partially or fully pollinate. But it's still cheaper to buy honeybees, to rent honeybees. At this point, it is still cheaper. So you have to get those farmers to make that leap, which we've used the issue of food security, of farm security, that honeybees prices have gone from $50 a hive to $400 a hive. It's still cheaper than putting in a bunch of habitat, but it's going up, and they may not have honeybees down, in the future. But we're also looking at the whole cadre of farm bill programs as well. So we're trying to maximize these services. We go to a farmer and talk about the pollination, talk about predators and pest control, talk about water quality, talk about other wildlife issues, and then talk about the financial incentives that NRCS does have. And it is that longer term thing. NRCS is pretty open to working, but you have to, it's like that giant aircraft carrier. They're moving, and you can't go to them in 1 year and say, we would like to focus on this area. And I know this. We've been working in California to try to get them to have an initiative on monarchs for several years, and it seems like now, and that's a potentially listed species, and I'm going down next week to meet with the technical advisory board for NRCS to talk about that and hopefully get that. But you have to, it's that slow process. So I think it's looking at as many things as possible. If you can stack ecosystem services along with quality of life issues, along with some incentives from the federal government to throw in, that's when we tend to get more adoption. And we're getting a lot of adoption in the Central Valley. Is it enough? Well, we'll see, but there's a lot of people interested. So
here on the Colorado Front Range, we have a couple of different efforts in payments for ecosystem services, water funds, and essentially looking at fire risk reduction and forest health improvement with fire and other treatments to maintain or improve water quality and quantity. And so there's several efforts underway at different kind of scales and different levels, and these are mostly voluntary situations rather than regulatory. We also have some efforts on nitrogen and phosphorus in the lower watersheds related to Clean Water Act, and those are more regulatory driven. But I would say, interestingly, the question about ecosystem services came out of our ranching community. We were looking at what other ways can we incentivize and raise the bar on practices on land stewardship and restoration, and at the same time recognize the true cost to be a good steward and to deliver good stewardship on the ground that then improves or guarantees those ecosystem services. And so, for most of the ranching community, their economic margin is narrow. The work that they do is really critical in maintaining those grasslands and wetland systems and so on. And so if we can kind of agree upon the best practices, really look at the economic value of those, and connect our urban communities downstream to recognize what it really takes to be a good steward, and then through water funds and payments for ecosystem services, then really recognize that cost and bring in new funding streams to support that level of stewardship, I think there's a real role there. The one thing that we really talked about very early on as we thought about this new tool was there's perhaps an ethical question here about placing a dollar value on nature. And that's kind of tricky. And we're still really struggling with how to do that in scientific ways and economic ways that make sense. But it's also kind of an ethical question for us as well as communities. But I do see it's a potential tool that could really have a lasting effect, especially for landowners who have done conservation easements. The next generation isn't going to benefit financially. They'll have the responsibility to do that. So raising the bar of their improvement of the condition of that property and that landscape, and recognizing the cost of that, is potentially an important tool going forward.
Not being a big proponent of ecosystem services, I don't think I have anything to add on this issue.
Well, do you have, okay, good, then perfect timing. Because we are out of time. I don't want to stop this conversation, but I know people have appointments to get to. I want to thank our guests. I especially want to thank Paula Fornwald and Lisa Smith there in the back, not just for their great microphone work, but for having the inspiration to invite this fantastic panel. And let's give them all a round of applause.